The first thing I noticed wasn't the smell of someone else's cologne in my bedroom. It was the key, my spare key, the one only my housekeeper was supposed to have, sitting in a small ceramic bowl by the front door, a bowl that wasn't mine. In my house, I stood in my own hallway at 9 at night, jet-lagged, car still running in the driveway with the trunk half open, and I stared at that bowl for what felt like a full minute before my brain caught up with what I was looking at. I want to walk you through exactly what happened over the following 3 weeks, because by the end of it, a woman I had trusted completely for years looked at me across my kitchen table like I was the villain in her story. Maybe I was. That's genuinely for you to decide. I've gone back and forth on it more times than I can count, but I'm going to give you the whole thing, start to finish, no skipped parts, and you can land wherever you land. Let's go back to the beginning. My name is Daniel. I am 34. I work in long-haul logistics, freight contracts, mostly cross-border, which is a fancy way of saying I'm sometimes gone for 2 weeks, sometimes gone for 6, and my house sits empty more often than most people's houses ever do. 4 years ago, right after I bought the place, I realized pretty quickly that an empty house for weeks at a time is a house that develops problems. Mail piles up in a way that practically advertises nobody's home. Plants die. Pipes freeze in winter if nobody's running water through them. I needed someone I could trust with a key, and I didn't know anyone local well enough to ask a favor that size. A co-worker recommended Elena. She'd been cleaning houses in the area for about 6 years by then, had a small but steady client list, and came with genuinely glowing word of mouth, the kind where 3 different people, unprompted, told me some version of she's the most reliable person I've ever hired. I met her for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon. She was maybe late 20s, practical, straightforward. She didn't oversell herself. She asked good questions. What days I traveled, whether I had pets, how I wanted mail handled, whether I cared if she used my kitchen to eat lunch on longer cleaning days. Small, considerate questions that told me she'd done this before and did it well. We agreed on a schedule, twice a week for cleaning, plus general house-sitting duties whenever I traveled. Watering plants, collecting packages, running water through the pipes, keeping an eye on things. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for the rest of this story. This wasn't a shaky, reluctant trust. This was trust that was built brick by brick, over 4 actual years, through 100 small moments where Elena could have cut corners and never did. She was the person who called me, unprompted, when a pipe started leaking under my kitchen sink while I was in another state. Caught it early enough that it was a $200 fix instead of a flooded kitchen. She was the person who noticed my mail carrier had started leaving packages on the porch in plain view and started bringing them inside without me even asking. She once texted me a photo of a crack that had appeared in my bathroom tile, worried it might be a foundation issue, when she easily could have said nothing and let me discover it myself months later. Over time, the relationship expanded the way these things naturally do. I gave her the garage door code so she wouldn't have to deal with the finicky front lock in bad weather. I gave her my Wi-Fi password so she could stream music or podcasts while she worked. I told her, more than once, just treat it like you treat your own place while I'm gone. The kind of thing you say when you genuinely mean it, not as a formality. By year 3, I wasn't thinking about my house at all when I traveled. That's what real trust buys you. The ability to stop worrying about something because you've handed it to someone who's earned the right to be trusted with it. I paid her well. I gave her a small holiday bonus every December, and honestly, I considered the arrangement one of the more uncomplicated good decisions I'd made as an adult. I bring all this up not to make myself look like a saint of an employer, but because I need you to understand the size of what was about to break. This wasn't a new hire I barely knew. This was for years. 2 months ago, I got a call from my sister. Our dad, Robert, 71, lives about 6 hours from me, had been hospitalized after a fall. Nothing life-threatening in the end, thank God, but serious enough that nobody was using the word fine yet. I booked a flight home the same day, packed in about 20 minutes, sent Elena a text before I even left for the airport. Hey, family emergency. Heading to my dad's for a bit. Not sure exactly how long, could be a week, could be 3. House is yours to manage like always. Thank you for this. She responded almost immediately. So sorry to hear that. Don't worry about anything here. I've got it covered. Take care of your dad. That text, looking back, reads completely different to me now than it did the day I got it. At the time, it was just Elena being Elena. steady, reliable. Exactly what I needed to hear in a moment when I had bigger things to think about. I got on a plane 40 minutes later and didn't think about my house again for the better part of 3 weeks. Why would I? I had no reason to. I won't spend too long on the hospital stretch because it's not really the point of this story, but I do want to give you a sense of what those weeks actually looked like for me because it matters for what comes later. My dad's fall turned out to be dehydration related, a bad scare, a short hospital stay, then a longer recovery period where my sister and I basically split shifts making sure he had help around the house, made it to follow-up appointments, and didn't push himself too hard to fast. It was exhausting in the low-grade, unglamorous way that caregiving usually is. Long days, bad sleep, a lot of hospital cafeteria coffee. Through all of it, I genuinely did not think about my house even once as a source of stress. I checked my phone constantly for updates from doctors, for texts from my sister, for anything urgent. But never once did it occur to me to worry about what was happening back home. That's what for years of trust does. It removes an entire category of anxiety from your life. By the start of week 3, my dad was stable, cranky in the way that meant he was recovering, and firmly insisting he didn't need either of us hovering anymore. My sister and I agreed I could head back early. I hadn't set a firm return date with Elena. I told her could be up to 3 weeks, so I decided not to give her advance notice. Partly it was just logistics, partly, if I'm honest, I liked the idea of walking back into a house that had been quietly, competently looked after in my absence. That was the whole appeal of Elena, after all. The house ran fine whether I announced my return or not. I booked a flight for 4 days earlier than my loosest estimate. I didn't text her. I figured I'd surprise the empty house with my own return, not the other way around. I landed a little after 7 in the evening, grabbed my bag, and drove the 40 minutes home half on autopilot, the way you do after a long stretch of travel and stress. I remember being genuinely relieved, looking forward to sleeping in my own bed, in my own house, for the first time in 3 weeks. I pulled into the driveway a little after 9, and the first thing that struck me, before anything else, was that the lights were on. Not just the porch light, which was on a timer, living room lights. A light in what I could see was my bedroom window. My first thought, honestly, was that Elena had left lights on by accident during a cleaning visit. It didn't occur to me to think anything darker than that. Not yet. I let myself in through the front door with my own key, dragging my suitcase behind me. And the first thing I registered, before I even fully processed it, was a duffel bag sitting at the base of my staircase. Not mine. A dark green duffel bag, half unzipped, with what looked like folded laundry inside it. Then I saw the shoes by the door. Men's shoes. Size 11. Maybe 12. Definitely not mine. I wear a 10. I stood there in my own entryway holding my suitcase, doing that thing where your brain tries out 3 or 4 harmless explanations in rapid succession before it accepts the obvious one. Maybe a friend of Elena's had dropped something off. Maybe a delivery had gone to the wrong house. Maybe a door opened upstairs. Footsteps, and then a man walked out of my bedroom. My bedroom, wearing a bathrobe. My bathrobe, the grey one that hangs on the back of my closet door. We looked at each other for what felt like an extremely long 4 or 5 seconds. Neither of us said a word. I think we were both doing the same math, from opposite directions. Him realizing the actual owner of the house had just walked in unannounced. Me realizing that a stranger had just walked out of my bedroom, like it was the most normal thing in the world. He spoke first. "Hey, you must be Daniel." That sentence told me more than almost anything else could have. He knew my name, which meant this wasn't a one-off, a misunderstanding, a single strange coincidence. This was a situation with history. He knew who I was before I knew who he was. His name was Marcus Reyes, late 20s, worked some kind of retail job downtown. Seemed, and I want to be fair here, genuinely mortified once the reality of the moment set in. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't defensive in the way people get when they're caught doing something and want to fight about it. If anything, he looked like a man who'd been quietly dreading this exact scenario for weeks and was almost relieved it was finally happening. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, what he was doing in my house. He told me he'd been renting the spare bedroom, my spare bedroom, the one I use as a home office when I'm not traveling, for the past 5 weeks. $600 a month, paid directly to Elena. In cash, no lease, no paperwork. He said Elena told him the owner traveled constantly and would probably never even know. And that, as far as he understood it, this was some kind of informal arrangement Elena had done before with other properties she managed. 5 weeks, not 3. 5. That detail sat with me longer than almost anything else in that conversation. 5 weeks meant this hadn't started when I left for my dad's. It had started 2 full weeks before that. Emergency call even happened, which meant my trip hadn't caused this. It had simply given Elena a stretch of guaranteed, uninterrupted time to stop worrying about me. Walking in and catching her mid-arrangement. My father's hospitalization was, from her side of things, a stroke of convenient timing. I remember feeling something shift in my chest at that thought. Less anger in that exact moment, more a kind of cold recalculation, the sense of rewinding 4 years of trust and re-examining it under a completely different light. I asked Marcus to sit down at my kitchen table while I made a call. I didn't yell at him. I didn't yell at anyone that night, actually, which surprised me later when I thought back on it. I'd have expected myself to be angrier in the moment than I actually was. Mostly what I felt was a very focused, very quiet kind of clarity, like the emotional part of my brain had stepped back to let a more practical part take over. I called Elena. It rang twice. Hey, Daniel, everything okay with your dad? Her voice was warm, easy, completely unbothered. The voice of someone who genuinely believed this call was about plants or mail. I'm home, I said, early. I'm standing in my kitchen right now. There was a pause. Not a long one, maybe 2 seconds, but long enough that I heard it. And I think she heard herself in it too. Because when she spoke again, her voice had changed register entirely. Oh, she said, okay. How was the flight? Elena, who's living in my spare bedroom? The silence that followed was longer this time. Genuinely long. I could hear her breathing. Could hear what sounded like her stepping outside somewhere. A door opening. When she finally spoke, she didn't try to deny it, which I'll give her credit for. Can I come over and explain in person? She said. Please, I don't want to do this over the phone. I told her that was fine. I told her to come over now. While I waited for Elena to arrive, Marcus and I sat in an unexpectedly civil silence for a while, and then, slowly, he started talking, not defensively, more like someone who'd been holding something in and needed somewhere to put it down. He told me he'd found the arrangement through a mutual acquaintance who knew Elena did informal house-sitting rentals on the side for a couple of the properties she managed. He said he'd been between leases, needed something short-term and cheap, and Elena had made it sound completely low risk. The owner traveled constantly. The room sat empty most of the year anyway, and as long as he kept things tidy and stayed quiet, nobody would ever be the wiser. He admitted, almost sheepishly, that some part of him had known it was wrong the whole time, that a stranger, paying cash into an undocumented arrangement to secretly live in someone else's house was not, in fact, a grey area, no matter how Elena had framed it. But 5 weeks of a good, cheap room had been enough to keep him from asking too many questions. He also told me something I didn't expect, that Elena had done this kind of thing before, at least once, with a different client's property, a house that sat empty for long stretches while the owners were away for work. He didn't know many details, just that it had come up once in conversation, offhand, like it was a known trick in her repertoire rather than a one-time lapse in judgment. That detail changed something for me. This wasn't a single moment of financial desperation and poor judgment. This was, potentially, a pattern. Elena showed up about 25 minutes later. She looked like she'd been crying in the car, or on the walk to the door, or both. I let her in, and the 3 of us stood in my kitchen in a configuration that felt almost absurd in how mundane it was, like a strange, quiet parent-teacher conference nobody had asked to attend. She started explaining before I even asked her to. She told me she'd fallen behind on her own rent about a month earlier, after a slow stretch of losing to clients back for reasons unrelated to her work. She said she'd been picking up whatever cleaning job she could find, but it wasn't closing the gap fast enough, and somewhere in that stretch of financial panic, she'd looked at my empty spare bedroom, a room that, in her words, just sat there doing nothing for weeks at a time, and told herself it was a practical solution rather than a betrayal. She said Marcus had been quiet, respectful, careful not to leave any trace during the 2 days a week she cleaned. She said she genuinely believed she could make it work without me ever finding out, and that once she'd caught up financially, she planned to end the arrangement quietly, and no one would ever know it happened. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since Marcus mentioned it. Had she done this before, at another property she managed? She hesitated, then admitted, yes, once, about 1.5 years earlier, with a different client's vacation home, for about 6 weeks, during a stretch when that client was traveling internationally for work. She said it had gone fine, that nothing had ever come of it, and that this had made her more confident the second time around would be equally low risk. That was the moment the last piece of my trust in her fully came apart. Not the money, not even the stranger in my house. It was the fact that this wasn't a single desperate decision. It was a strategy she'd used before, successfully enough that she'd felt comfortable repeating it. I want to pause here and tell you what I didn't do, because I think it matters, and because a lot of people who've heard shorter versions of this story assumed I lost my temper in that kitchen. I didn't. I didn't raise my voice at Elena. I didn't raise my voice at Marcus. I didn't throw anyone out into the night without a plan, and I didn't say anything in the heat of the moment that I later regretted. What I did instead, and I'll admit this was partly instinct and partly the very practical, unemotional part of my brain that had taken over back when Marcus first walked out of that bedroom, was start building a record. I asked Marcus calmly if he'd be willing to show me the messages between him and Elena discussing the arrangement, dates, payment amounts, anything in writing. He agreed almost immediately, I think partly out of guilt and partly out of a genuine desire to make this right in whatever small way he could. He forwarded me a group chat thread that went back nearly 6 weeks. Conversations about move-in timing, about keeping things quiet while the owner's away, about the $600 cash payments changing hands. I told Marcus he had 1 hour to gather his things. He didn't argue. If anything, he seemed almost relieved the whole thing was finally publicly over, like he'd been carrying a low hum of guilt for 5 weeks and was glad to set it down, even at the cost of an uncomfortable, embarrassing exit. Elena, I told, would need to come back the next morning. I said I needed time to think, and that I wasn't going to make any decision standing in my kitchen at 10 at night, running on jet lag and adrenaline. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and did something that surprised even me in how methodical it felt. I built a file. I pulled the smart lock entry logs from my home security app, which timestamped every single door entry over the previous 6 weeks, proof of Marcus's regular comings and goings while I was supposedly the only person with legitimate access. I saved the messages Marcus had forwarded me, screenshotted and organized by date. I pulled up the original service agreement Elena had signed 4 years earlier, back when I'd hired her, and found the clause, buried in fairly standard boilerplate language, but there that explicitly prohibited any unauthorized third party from accessing or occupying the premises without written owner consent. By the time the sun came up, I had a folder, printed, organized, dated, not because I was building a legal case. I wasn't planning to sue anyone, but because I wanted the conversation that was about to happen to be grounded in something other than just my anger or her explanation. I wanted facts on the table. Elena arrived at 10 the next morning, as agreed. She looked like she hadn't slept either. I invited her in, sat her down at the same kitchen table, and slid the folder across to her. I told her I wasn't interested in yelling, and I wasn't interested in relitigating the explanation she'd already given me the night before. I told her I understood, in a purely human sense, that financial desperation makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do, and that I didn't think she was some cartoonish villain. I thought she was someone who'd made a serious, repeated breach of trust and needed to face real consequences for it, the same way anyone would in a professional relationship built on this level of access and responsibility. Then I laid out what was going to happen. First, her employment was terminated, effective immediately, citing the breach of the signed agreement, the unauthorized third-party occupancy clause specifically. I had it printed and highlighted in the folder in front of her. Second, I told her I would be informing at least one other client I knew she currently worked for, a neighbor to streets over named Greg, who I'd become genuinely friendly with over the years, and who I knew also employed Elena for regular cleaning. I told her this wasn't about revenge. I said this directly to her, and I meant it, but about the fact that if she'd done this twice now, at 2 different properties, then anyone else trusting her with unsupervised access to their home deserved to know what that trust might actually include when they weren't looking. Third, and this was the part where I saw something in her genuinely break, I told her I wasn't going to provide a reference for any future work, and if asked directly by any future employer, I would tell the truth about why the arrangement ended. She didn't argue with any of it, which I think surprised me more than anything else that happened over those 2 days. I'd expected some pushback, some negotiation, maybe even anger directed back at me. Instead, she sat there and cried, not performatively, not in a way that felt like manipulation, just quietly. The way people cry when a consequence they'd been avoiding thinking about finally fully lands. She told me she never thought I'd actually find out. She told me the money had genuinely kept her from losing her own apartment during the worst of the financial stretch, and that some small part of her had convinced herself that made it justified, even though she knew, underneath that justification, it wasn't. She said the idea of me telling Greg felt like the worst part of everything, worse than losing the job with me, because Greg represented her ability to keep working in this line of work at all, in this neighborhood, with the reputation she'd need to keep earning it. I told her I understood that, and that it was, in fact, the point. She left about 20 minutes later. I remember standing in my kitchen afterward, in the quiet, feeling less triumphant than I expected to feel. Mostly, I just felt tired and a little sad, in the specific way you feel sad when something that used to work well in your life stops working, even when the ending is entirely justified. I want to be honest about the part of this story that some people find harder to sit with. I did follow through on telling Greg. I went over a few days later, told him the situation plainly, without much editorializing, and let him decide what to do with the information. He wasn't being subletted to. As far as either of us could tell, nothing in his house had been disturbed, but he told me he appreciated knowing regardless, and that it changed how he thought about the unsupervised access he'd given her for the past 2 years. What Greg did with that information after our conversation, I honestly don't know. I didn't ask him to fire her, and I made a point of not pushing him toward any particular decision. I just felt like withholding the information entirely wasn't something I could justify to myself, given what had happened to me. Whether she lost other clients because of it, whether word spread further through the neighborhood on its own, I genuinely don't know, and at a certain point, stopped trying to find out. It's been just over 2 months since the night in my driveway. My locks are changed, all of them, including the garage code, which I should probably have thought to change years before any of this happened. In hindsight, just as a matter of basic practice, I don't have a housekeeper anymore. I water my own plants now, and I'm bad at it. I've already lost one that Elena had somehow kept alive for 4 straight years without my noticing how much effort that actually took. I think about the small, ordinary competence of those for years more than I expected to. It's strange missing something that turned out to be built on a foundation I didn't fully understand. I don't miss Elena exactly, but I do sometimes miss the version of my life where I didn't have to think about my house at all when I traveled, the version where trust like that felt uncomplicated. About 3 weeks after everything happened, Elena sent me a long text. I won't read the whole thing, but the gist of it was this. She said the situation had ruined her professionally, that she'd lost more work than she expected, that she'd been in a genuinely bad place mentally since it all came out. She didn't ask me to undo anything. She said she just wanted me to know the impact it had. I read it twice. I didn't respond. I've thought about that decision more than once since. Whether silence was the right call, whether I owed her some kind of closing acknowledgement after 4 years of an otherwise good working relationship. I still don't have a clean answer for myself. Here's the thing I keep turning over weeks later, and it's the reason I wanted to tell this whole story instead of just the short, satisfying version of it. The short version is simple. She broke my trust. I found out. I responded with consequences. End of story. Roll credits. That version feels clean. It feels justified. Most people I've told this story to in person land firmly on you did the right thing. And honestly, most days, I agree with them. But there's a longer, messier version sitting underneath that one. For genuinely good years don't just disappear because of 5 bad weeks. Or, as it turns out, 5 weeks that were really the second half of a pattern going back further than I knew. I keep asking myself whether telling Greg was accountability, or whether it tipped into something closer to making sure she couldn't quietly rebuild elsewhere. I keep asking whether refusing to respond to that last text was appropriate, boundary setting, or just me avoiding a harder, more human conversation because the easier version of the story, the villain and victim version, was more comfortable to sit in. I don't have it fully worked out. I'm not sure I ever will. What I do know is that trust, once you find out it was conditional the whole time, doesn't just snap back into place because the other person apologizes or explains their circumstances. It just doesn't work that way, at least not for me. So here's what I want to ask you, because I think this is genuinely a harder question than it looks on the surface. If you found a stranger living in your house after 5 weeks of secret subletting by someone you trusted for years, where's your line? Did you handle it quietly, the way I originally tried to, with a private conversation and determination and nothing more? Or do you think what I did, telling another client, refusing any future reference, was fair accountability, or something closer to overkill? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the most interesting perspectives on this whole situation have come from people who disagreed with how I handled it. So don't hold back. If you want to hear more of the specifics, what exactly was in that group chat thread with Marcus, how the conversation with Greg actually went almost word for word, or what happened with the neighbor's own housekeeper situation afterward, let me know down below, and I'll put together a follow-up. Thanks for watching. If this kept you hooked the whole way through, hit subscribe. I post stories like this every week, and the community in the comments here has honestly become one of my favorite parts of doing this. See you in the next one.